Clara Whitmore pointed a finger at my face during the HOA meeting, shouting, "You don't deserve to live here." I, Marcus Ellington, stood up abruptly, coldly replying, "This land is mine. You're the one leeching off it. And when the steel dam gates open, the water will speak for me, drowning that arrogant, discriminatory attitude. Justice isn't just a slogan on a wall. It's the flood that drowns the abuser of power. What state are you in? If it were you, would you dare to pull the lever?" I returned to the family land after many years of separation, carrying with me a sense of both heaviness and longing to reconnect with the past. The road leading to the old fields was still there, but instead of the vast meadows and the oak trees my father had planted, what lay before me now was a sight that squeezed my heart. On the plot of land that once belonged to my family, 35 luxurious homes stood side by side. Shiny walls, evenly paved driveways, and straight white fences stood tall, seemingly flaunting their standards. I was stunned, my whole body feeling frozen. This land used to be where my father bent down to plant seed, where he taught me the meaning of hard work and dignity. It was also the place where I lay down after long, tiring days, where my childhood was intertwined with the scent of wet earth and the sound of birds calling to their flock. Yet now, all of it had turned into a glossy, unfamiliar community, so alien that I had to ask myself if I had somehow wandered into another world. I walked slowly, each step feeling like I was treading on stolen memory. My heart raced, and the hot blood surged as I saw a large sign erected at the gate: Lakeside Community, property of the HOA. My vision blurred, and it felt as though someone had slapped me straight across the face. Just a few capitalized words, but they carried a challenge, as though they were erasing every trace of the Ellington family from this land. In my daze, I heard the sound of steady footsteps on the stone path. A woman appeared, her posture confident, her gait straight as though she held power. Her blonde hair was styled elaborately, and her eyes were as cold as steel. She stopped in front of me, a sneer of contempt curling her lip. "You must be mistaken. This is part of the community now." Her voice was smooth, sweet, but laced with disdain. Her name was Clara Whitmore, the HOA president of this area, the one whom the entire community feared to speak of. I had heard a few stories about her, but I never imagined I would become the direct victim of such arrogance. In that moment, Clara appeared before me as a usurper, standing proudly on the rubble of someone else's honor, basking in her self-importance. I clenched my fists, my knuckles turning white from the pressure. "This land was left by my father. What gives you the right to seize it?" My voice dropped low, trying to hold back the anger, but each word cut like a knife. I wasn't speaking only for myself, but for the memory of my father, for the truth being shamelessly distorted right before my eyes. Clara took a small step back, then suddenly smirked. Her eyes glinted with mockery, as if I had just performed a joke. "Entitlement? Here, I am the law." Her words weren't loud, but they were enough to send a chill down my spine, not because of fear, but because of fury. A person who saw themselves as the ultimate authority, daring to stand above justice to trample others, was boldly proclaiming it in front of me. In that moment, I saw clearly how absurdity had turned into actual power, cloaked in the guise of community, but in reality, a blatant abuse of power. Each of those houses felt like a knife stabbing into my memories, and every laugh from Clara was humiliating. I felt my whole body tremble, but my eyes never left face. I looked around, and a few residents were standing at a distance, watching quietly, their eyes evasive. No one dared to intervene because they knew that confronting Clara meant inviting disaster, but their silence only made the air feel thicker, more suffocating. Silence meant complicity. I felt alone, but that very loneliness fueled the fire of my anger even more intensely. Clara moved closer, lowering her voice just enough for me to hear, "You'd better get used to it. Here, people like you don't have a voice." She emphasized people like you with a look of disdain, and I understood all too well what she meant. This was no longer about land. It was about blatant discrimination, the contempt for skin color, cloaked in standard language. I took a deep breath, suppressing the rage, and replied firmly, "You've gotten used to thinking you're the law, but the real law will come for you, and when that day comes, you'll know what it's like for this land to swallow those who dare to offend it." Clara burst into laughter, her shrill laugh cutting through the air like a knife. "Are you threatening me? You think an old man like you could defeat the entire HOA?" She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the stone ground, leaving behind a trail of perfume as pungent as her arrogance. I stood there, watching her figure fade, my heart still pounding. The sight of the 35 houses before me suddenly became blurry in my eyes. I knew it clearly, this battle had only just begun, and I also knew that my opponent was not just Clara Whitmore, but an entire system nurtured by fear and silence. But if she thought I would bow my head, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I turned away and left the land, my anger simmering within me. On the road leading to the lake, the wind blew fiercely, carrying the sharp chill of the water. I looked to the north, where the old dam had remained silent for many years. Suddenly, a thought flashed through my mind mind like a bolt of lightning. That dam still belonged to my family, a secret that Clara didn't know. I pursed my lips, my eyes flashing with resolve. If she wanted to make me an outsider on the very land my father had left behind, I would show her that the water would speak for me. From that moment, I knew this battle was not just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming honor, dignity, and justice. And Clara Whitmore would soon realize that the one she looked down upon was the one who would drown her. I arrived at the conference room in the afternoon, the remaining sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long, cold streaks across the floor. The room, which was typically where the residents met monthly, felt thick tension today, as if everyone was waiting for a performance. The chairs were arranged neatly in rows, the chairman's desk placed in the center, with a large sign hanging above it that read, "Lakeside Residents Meeting, Upholding Community Standard." Just reading those words, I could already feel the trap set, and the person behind it was none other than Clara Whitmore. She stepped out from behind the desk, walking with confidence, wearing a smile that only someone accustomed to holding power could have. Clara's gaze swept over everyone, stopping at me as if she wanted to carve open a wound. As the room remained silent, she pointed directly at me, her voice ringing out evenly, as if prepared for this moment. "Some people don't meet our standard." Her words echoed through the room, making many residents hold their breath. Some lowered their heads to their papers, and others looked at me with suspicion. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly across the cold floor. I looked directly at Clara, my voice firm. "Not meeting the standards, or are you distorting the law?" The room immediately buzzed with whispers. The murmur grew like a beehive stirred, and I felt the eyes of dozens of people on me, some curious, some disdainful, and most avoiding eye contact. They looked at me like an outsider disrupting their familiar order. I could see a few shaking heads, some faint smiles, and an overwhelming silence enveloping the majority. Clara stood there, her face unchanged, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment to deliver the final blow. She took a step closer, lowering her voice but throwing her words like hammers. "This neighborhood isn't for your kind of skin." The space seemed to explode in my head. I could hear a few sharp intakes of breath. Some people were startled, but no one spoke out in protest. Clara had said it plainly, without any pretense, no need to hide the discrimination that had seeped into her attitude. Her words cut into me like a knife, but at the same time, they ignited the fiery anger I had been trying to suppress since discovering my land had been taken. I looked around, seeing faces looking down, eyes avoiding mine. I noticed a middle-aged man in the front row, his lips moving as if he wanted to say something, but he stopped when Clara's gaze fell on him. Their silence was complicity, and I knew it was what had fueled her power all these years. I walked up to the chairman's desk, my voice lowering but every word cutting through the air. "You can cloak yourself in standards to cover it up, but the essence remains the same. This land belongs to my family, and you've turned it into a tool for profit. And now, you dare stand here and insult my skin, thinking everyone will bow their head." Clara tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with amusement. She replied in a sharp, biting tone, "You can scream all you want, but no one here believes you. They know who brings value to this community, and it's not someone who claims old land as their own." The whispers rose again, some residents nodding, as though Clara had just bestowed upon them a truth. I clenched my teeth, feeling of fury swelling inside me like a rising tide. But instead of shouting, I kept my voice cold and sharp. "You want to turn everyone into an audience for your humiliating performance. But remember, every show has an end, and it's you who will bow your head." She laughed, a victorious smile that made the air in the room even more suffocating. I noticed a few residents subtly shifting their chairs, as if trying to distance themselves from the confrontation. But my gaze caught a few other looks from people who seemed uncomfortable, even a bit ashamed. They remained silent, but I knew that Clara's words weren't easy for them to swallow. I took a deep breath, my eyes fixed on the crowd. "Look at me. If she can stand here and openly insult my skin, then who among you will be the next victim tomorrow? Today, it's my land. Tomorrow, it will be your home. And at that point, your silence will come back to swallow you whole." The room was tension. Clara stood with her arms crossed, posing like a conqueror, but I noticed her eyes flicker briefly, a tiny crack in her confident facade. I saw it, and I knew that, no matter how loudly she shouted, my words had planted a seed of doubt in the hearts of a few. When the meeting ended, I walked out, my head held high, my heart still pounding with anger. Behind me, I heard Clara whispering to a group of her loyal residents, "Don't worry, I'll make that old man disappear from this neighborhood." Laughter bubbled up, mingling with the sound of heels clicking sharply on the stone floor, like the shattering of every last piece of honor. I paused briefly on the step, taking in a deep breath of the cold air. I knew I had stepped into a fight I couldn't win easily, but in that moment, I saw the true face of the HOA, a power built on complicity, on the fear of the crowd, and on discrimination dressed up in the pretty name of standard. Clara thought she had humiliated me, but in reality, she had just exposed her own shamelessness for everyone to see. I walked on, my heart storming but my eyes eyes unwavering. I swore that I would not let today's meeting end with Clara's smug smile, and I knew that from the moment she uttered those discriminatory words, everything had changed. This fight was no longer just about land. It was about exposing the true face of those who used the law as a tool to trample human dignity. I made my way toward the lake, where the wind stirred the water, creating ripples across the surface. In the fading light, I saw my reflection, my eyes showing the anger and determination within me. I knew that the meeting had been just the opening act, and the real storm was still waiting ahead. Clara might think I was an outsider, but it was her arrogance that had turned me into an opponent who would never back down. That day, amidst the complicity of silence that filled the room, I heard the most direct insult of my life. But I also saw the first crack in Clara Whitmore's wall of power, and I swore that I would use the truth itself to tear down that wall, until she and the entire HOA had to pay the price. That afternoon, I drove my old pickup truck back home after a long day filled with tedious paperwork. The weight of the previous day's HOA meeting still pressed heavily on my chest. Clara's insults echoed in my head like a toxic refrain, keeping my heart in a constant state of unrest. I drove slowly down the asphalt road leading to my house, with neatly trimmed grass on either side, cut to a point of indifference, and rows of trees planted in straight lines, visually pleasing but soulless. The entire landscape felt like a staged set, where every small detail was forced into the so-called community standards Clara always preached. As I turned the corner toward my home, I saw an HOA security vehicle blocking the road. Two men in dark uniforms stepped out, their demeanor aggressive. One of them approached the front of my truck and raised his hand to signal me to stop. I rolled down my window, my eyes calm, but an uneasy feeling settled deep within me. The man blocking my path was a large, red-faced guy with stubble on his chin and a look of contempt in his eyes. He knocked sharply on the hood of my truck, then leaned down to look at me, his voice thick. "Vehicle papers, residency permit, driver's license. Show them now." I furrowed my brow and asked, "Why should I give you my papers? I'm just driving home. What's the reason you're stopping me in the middle of the road like I'm a criminal?" He smirked, a grin mixed provocation and threat. "The rules around here are that we can check any time. You live here, you'd better get used to it. People like you should know to stay quiet. No one here believes you." His words made my blood boil. I knew exactly what he meant by the phrase, "people like you." This wasn't just about checking paper. It was a way to humiliate, to remind me that, in their eyes, I was an outsider. My skin color looked down upon in a community they saw as superior. I opened the door, stepped out, and stood tall in front of him. The afternoon sun lit up his flushed face, while I kept my gaze cold. My voice dropped, each word coming out slowly and deliberately. "You've chosen the wrong person to humiliate and do one." Both security guards briefly recoiled at my stand, quickly masked their surprise with dismissive laughter. The large guy growled, "Who do you think you are? Around here, we take orders from Clara Whitmore. You'd better not resist. Don't forget, just one signature from her, and you'll be out of this neighborhood." I squinted at him, unmoving. In my mind, I saw my father, the man who taught me never to bow to injustice, the one who instilled in me the belief that honor was more important than anything. I heard my own voice echoing back, firm and resolute. "I live on my father's land. No one has the right to drive me out. And if you think you can stand above the law, then it's you who will pay the price." The atmosphere grew heavy. A few neighbors from afar peeked out their windows, quickly drew the curtains back. I knew they had heard, but their silence was the safety net they chose. For a moment, I felt alone, but that very loneliness only made me more determined. Another security guard, thinner but with sharp, cold eyes, stepped forward to intervene. "That's enough, Marcus. We're just following the rules. If you cooperate, we'll let you go. But if you want to cause trouble, don't say we didn't warn you. We could report you for disturbing the community." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Disturbing the community? You're blocking my car, forcing me to present unreasonable documents, and then accusing me of disturbing the peace? This is nothing but a farce." The large man moved closer, the smell of tobacco and sweat hitting me hard. He lowered his voice, whispering venomously, "You think anyone here will stand by you? Look around. No one wants to get involved. Even if we kick you out of this neighborhood, no one will speak up. You'll just be an old man to be looked down upon." Oh. I held his gaze without blinking, staring straight into his eyes. In that moment, I felt an odd sense of calm, as if my anger had turned into cold steel within me. I responded slowly, emphasizing each word. "Maybe you're right. Maybe no one will speak up, but one day, this silence will shatter. And when it does, people like you will be swept away first." The two guards stood silent for a few seconds. Then the thinner one gave a dry laugh, pulling his companion back. "Let's go. Don't waste any more words on him." They turned and headed back to their vehicle, throwing one last disdainful look at me before starting the engine and driving off. I stood there, my heart pounding, breath heavy. I didn't know if they would report this to Clara, but I was sure she would find a way to increase the pressure on me. The confrontation was just a test, a slap to my honor to see if I would bow my head, and I had responded in the only way I knew, face to face, never backing down. I turned back to the truck, my hands still slightly trembling smiling but my eyes brighter than ever. I knew I had just reaffirmed to myself that I wouldn't let anyone, whether it was Clara Whitmore or her lackeys, trample on my family's honor and land. Everything they did today only made me more certain that this fight had to be carried to the very end. On the drive home, I recalled the faces of each neighbor who had peered through their windows only to quickly pull the curtains shut. I understood their fear. They were used to living in a safe zone, accustomed to bowing their heads to maintain peace. But that peace was nothing more than a gilded cage, and they were the ones locking themselves inside it with their silence. I didn't blame them, but I despised that silence. Because if everyone chooses silence, people like Clara will forever manipulate and continue to trample on others. When I stopped the car in front of the house, I sat still for a moment. I thought about Naomi, about the worry in her eyes when she saw me face Clara during the meeting the day before. I didn't want my daughter to live in fear, and I certainly didn't want her to believe that silence was the only way to survive. I had to show her that honor could not be bargained with, that justice might be distorted, but one day it would return, as long as we didn't give up. I stepped out of the truck and looked up at the sky, now turning a strong gust of wind blew by, carrying the scent of water from the distant lake. In that moment, I remembered the old dam, where I had once stood with my father, watching the water spill over the bank. That dam now lay dormant, like a secret waiting to be awakened. The thought made my heart beat a little faster, as if reminding me that I held a weapon Clara didn't even know about. I smiled softly, but not a happy smile, more the smile of someone who had made up their mind. Clara and her minions might think they had humiliated me today, but they didn't know that their arrogance had just opened a door leading to a counterattack that, once I decided, nothing would stop. If you were in my shoes, would you remain silent or strike back when you were humiliated on your own land? After the encounter with the HOA security guards, I knew for certain that Clara wouldn't stop. She had tasted my resistance, and instead of backing down, she chose to escalate with even more devious tactic. A few days later, the mailbox in front of my house began filling up with envelopes stamped with the HOA logo. Each time I opened one, my heart seemed to tighten just a little more. A fine for grass higher than the permitted height, even though I had just hired someone to mow it less than a week ago. Another fine for a photo of the paint on the back of the house, claiming it didn't match the approved shade, according to the rule. Then there was the metal mailbox I had installed when I moved in, suddenly deemed not up to community standard. These papers piled up like invisible lash, not because of the fines, but because of the arrogance evident in every word. They weren't written to protect any values, but to turn me into a target. I held each paper, staring at Clara's scrawled signature, and understood that she was using the law like a whip, striking straight into my pride. That whip didn't just strike me. One morning, Naomi came home from school with red eyes, her head bowed low. I pressed her, and finally, she broke into tears. "Dad, they said we don't deserve to live here. Some of them even said the HOA would kick us out soon." Her voice trembled, each word tearing into my heart. I held her close, feeling her choking breath against me. She had already endured so much since her mother passed, and now she had to bear cruel taunts from kids, repeating the voices of their parents. I saw in Naomi's eyes not just tears, fear. She was beginning to believe that the whispers of the adults could decide her family's fate. That was exactly what Clara wanted, to make us outsiders so isolation could crush our will. That evening, after Naomi had fallen asleep in her room, I sat alone in the living room, the golden light from the lamp spilling over the pile of fines stacked on the table. I looked at them as if they were trash, but I knew full well they were tools Clara was using to tighten the noose. I could stay silent no longer. I stepped outside and walked straight to the largest house at the end of the block Clara lived. The sky had just darkened, and the light from the windows shone brightly, the scent of fine wine and gourmet food hanging in the air. I knocked forcefully on the wooden door. The sound echoed, dry and hollow. A few seconds later, Clara appeared, draped in a silk robe, holding a glass of red wine. Her eyes flashed with irritation, but the corners of her mouth curled into a faint smile. "I guess you've come to pay your fine," she said, her voice smooth as if this were all some kind of amusement. I met her gaze. No need for pleasantry. "You've turned the law into a whip to lash at my daughter?" My voice hissed clenched teeth, each word carrying the anger that had been building up over the days. Clara smirked, the smile sending a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about? I'm doing all of this for the community. And this community, Mr. Ellington, doesn't need people like you." I felt my hand tremble. Not out of fear, but because of overwhelming rage. She didn't hide it, didn't even need to mask it with rules or standards anymore. She spoke plainly, saying what everyone knew but no one had dared to say out loud, that in her eyes, I didn't deserve to be here because of my skin color, because of the name Ellington, because of the history of the land she wanted to steal. A strong gust of wind blew through the hallway, tossing Clara's blonde hair and making the wine in her glass sway a deep red. Her eyes seemed to swallow me whole. In that moment, I understood more clearly than ever. This fight wasn't just about land land or the house. This was a fight to preserve dignity, to show Naomi that her father would never kneel before an arrogant person. Clara turned as if the conversation was over, but I spoke again, my voice deeper, more resolute. You want to make an example of me to scare everyone, but it's you who is turning yourself into living proof of abuse of power. Remember, every game you play will come back to crush you. And for. She paused for a moment, then burst into laughter, her sharp laugh echoing through the hallway. Who will believe you? People have lived under my rule for years, and they know that silence is the safest way. You and your daughter are just outsiders, and sooner or later you'll have to leave. I turned away, my heart pounding, my hands still clenched as if I wanted to crush fines into dust. My footsteps echoed on the stone path, but in my mind, I heard Naomi's whisper. I heard Clara's mocking laugh. They all blended together, a reminder that this battle had gone far beyond fake regulation. It had reached into flesh and blood, into honor, and into the future of my daughter. When I got back, I saw Naomi sitting in the living room, still awake, her eyes red. I walked over and hugged her, whispering, "Don't let their words make you afraid. This is our home, and we're not leaving." I felt her small hand trembling in mine, but in her eyes, there was a spark of hope. I knew she was waiting for me to prove that promise through action. I sat down and opened the old file my father had left. The documents proving land ownership, old maps, sales receipts all right here. Under the roof Clara wanted to turn into a temporary shelter for outsiders. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper mixed with dust, and I swore to myself I would protect. The fines Clara had sent weren't just unreasonable numbers. They were declarations of war, wrapped in a legal disguise. I knew she would keep going, but I was ready. If she wanted to use the law to defeat me, I would show her that the real law would stand with me. And if she wanted to shame my daughter, I would use the truth to turn her into a laughingstock. That night, I stood by the window, looking out at the empty yard. The dim moonlight shone down on the land my father had once worked. Even though outside, 35 new houses stood tall, in my heart, this was still the land of the Ellington family. And I swore, with everything I had left in my life, I would keep it for Naomi, so she would know that some things cannot be stolen, no matter how powerful the thief may be. That evening, the air around Lakeside Lake filled with laughter and chatter. The lights from the newly built houses reflected off the water, creating shimmering streaks of brightness. The HOA had set up a temporary tent made of white fabric right by the water's edge, tables and chairs neatly arranged, glasses of wine clinking together. People gathered in small groups, laughing and talking animatedly, as if the lands they had taken had always belonged to them. The soothing music from the speakers mixed with the smell of grilled meat and wine made the party even more lively. In the midst of all this, Clara Whitmore stood out like a queen. She wore an elegant long dress, striding through the crowd with a glass of red wine in her hand. Every eye was on her, half in awe, half in fear, knowing that defying Clara would only bring trouble. I saw her raise her glass high, proud smile on her face. Her voice echoed through the speakers, clear and sharp. "Marcus is nothing here." The applause erupted, accompanied by a few whistles of approval. I stood still on the edge of the grass, the darkness surrounding me, my eyes following Clara and the drunken crowd. I felt the blood rush through my veins, but outwardly, I remained calm. Her words felt like a knife to the heart, but at the same time, it was the ultimate challenge. Clara thought she had won, that I was nothing more than an outsider being ridiculed. But what she didn't know was that I held something that the entire HOA had no idea about. I looked up at the surface of the lake. The water was calm, like a mirror, reflecting the golden light from the hanging lamps along the walkway. At the source, where the dark forest embraced the flow, the old dam still lay still after all these years. It had once been a project my father helped build to control the water supply for the entire area. Generations of Ellingtons had seen it as the lifeblood of the land, both to nourish it and to protect the lake from flooding. To everyone else, it was just an old, neglected dam, forgotten for years. But to me, it was the key. The door to a truth Clara could never imagine. The thought struck me like a flash of lightning. This was something the HOA didn't know. While Clara stood there, arrogantly declaring herself the law, with the crowd cheering her on as if no one dared to oppose her, I felt an extraordinary calm. Because I knew all that arrogance was standing on land that belonged to my family. All those bright houses, all those lavish parties, placed in the wrong spot. And with one small move from me, it would all turn into a pile of rubble. I whispered to myself, "It's time for them to pay." I didn't speak loudly, but each word in my mind felt like the beat of a drum, echoing relentlessly. I watched Clara raise her glass again, her voice floating on the breeze. "We'll turn this place into a model community, and no one can stop us." The crowd cheered, clapped, and some even laughed, as if her words were a prophecy. But I didn't hear them. I only heard the distant sound of water flowing, coming from the old dam. In that moment, I felt as though I was standing between two worlds. One side was artificial light, false power built on fear and complicity. valley. The other side was the quiet dark where the lake's calm surface concealed a destructive force. I belonged to that darkness, and I knew I would use it to end the game Clara had set up. I turned away, leaving the party in silence. The music and laughter still echoed behind me, but in my mind, they were nothing more than empty noise. I walked along the lake, my eyes fixed on the dark stretch of forest where the dam hid. Memories of my father flooded back. I saw him standing on the dam, teaching me how water could nourish, but also destroy. Water always finds its path, Marcus, he once said. When it's held back too long, it will sweep everything away. His words echoed in my mind, making my thoughts clearer. I knew I couldn't act recklessly. Every move had to be calculated, but I also understood that Clara had unintentionally pushed me to the final boundary. When she publicly humiliated me in front of the crowd, when she made my name a joke at the party, she bet everything on my silence. And that was her greatest mistake. That night, when I returned home, Naomi was still awake. She looked at me with concern in her eye. "Dad, I heard they're throwing a party because they think they've kicked us out." I sat beside her, placing my hand on her shoulder. "They can think whatever they want," I replied, "but the truth is still in our hand." Naomi didn't fully understand, but I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I went to my study and spread my father's old maps across the table. The maps showed land boundaries, the layout of the dam, and the water conduit. I traced each detail, each faded symbol from the years gone by. The more I looked, the more my resolve grew stronger. Clara could strut around the hall, order the security, and bribe the residents with empty promises, but there was one thing she couldn't control: the flow of water. I wondered, did Clara ever imagine the possibility of all those new houses being swept away by the flood? Could she picture those who once cheered for her running in panic, only to see the law she claimed to stand for be drowned? I knew that image might send shivers down many spines, but to me, it was justice. Justice wasn't always gentle. Sometimes it was a storm, flood, force that restored balance to a land that had been stolen. In the stillness of the night, I sat looking at the old papers, my heart burning with fire. Clara thought she had humiliated me with one sentence, but in reality, she had just given me the final reason to never back down. I knew from this point on, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. My land, my honor, Naomi's future, everything was now tied to this battle. And I would fight to the end, until Clara Whitmore and the HOA she claimed as the law had to kneel before the truth. I didn't sleep that night, the night Clara hosted the party by the lake. Her word, "Marcus is nothing here," lingered in my mind, twisting like an unhealing wound. I knew that to defeat her, it couldn't just be through anger. I needed solid evidence. So, I sat down with the old files my father had left behind, flipping through the yellowed pages, land maps, and sales receipts, all meticulously preserved over decades. That night, under the dim glow of the desk lamp, I spread them out like a battlefield of documents. Each sheet of paper was a part of my family's history. There was one showing the date my father bought the land by the lake, another certifying our permanent rights to it. Everything was notarized, stamped, and legal, no loophole. The more I looked, the more disgusted I became by the audacity of Clara and the HOA board. They built houses, sold land, and promised the residents that it was for the community, while the certificate still clearly stated, "Owner, Ellington family." I decided not to wait any longer. The next morning, I made copies of all the documents, photographed each page, and sent them to a group of residents who had long suspected Clara. I knew many of them remained silent, not because they believed her, but because they feared retaliation. Along with the documents, I included a brief message. "The truth is here. Read it and decide for yourself." The news spread faster than I thought. Within hours, several neighbors passed the stack of papers among themselves. They whispered, some in surprise, others shaking their head as if they couldn't believe it. Doubt began to grow, creeping into every home, every afternoon tea conversation. Some familiar faces knocked on my door, asking, "Marcus, is the land still in your name?" I showed them the originals, so they could see for themselves bolded word, "Owner, Ellington family." Still, there were stubborn heads. Some mocked that the papers could be forged. Clara would never dare deceive the entire community. But I knew they didn't truly believe their words. They were just holding on to the safety of silence. I didn't respond much, choosing silence instead, because I understood that silence now wasn't weakness, but a way for the truth to spread on its own. I let the documents speak for themselves, letting the words and seals tap into the conscience of each person. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Someone had posted photos on social media of Clara approving the construction designs for the residential area on my land. The pictures clearly showed Clara's hand holding a pen, her smiling face beside HOA board members laughing and chatting. Beneath the photo, the caption showed the date that matched the time she brazenly built those houses. Within hours, the photos were shared widely. Posts began appearing. "HOA steals land from people of color. Is this abuse of power or outright theft? Who gave them the right to do this?" Outrage poured in, like a swelling tide Clara never saw coming. I sat in front of the screen, watching as new comments appeared, as strangers expressed their anger on my behalf. One post on a major forum gained thousands of shares. The author asserted that this wasn't just my issue, but a clear example of the abuse of power by HOA organizations across the United States. Some even shared their own bitter experiences with neighborhood councils, being fined for hanging flag, being forbidden to have pet, being forced to change the paint color just because it didn't meet standard. My story had suddenly become the spark for long simmering anger. Of course, Clara knew about it. I heard she held an emergency meeting with her allies on the board, trying to argue that the photos were doctored, that the documents I provided were no longer legally valid. But her words couldn't put out the fire that had erupted. People didn't need me to speak much, as the truth was already so clear. I chose silent. I didn't post anything, didn't engage in arguments, didn't publicly refute. I knew I didn't need to. Once the public had grasped the truth, they would speak for me. I just sat in my small room, beside the stack of old papers, listening to the phone ring constantly, receiving a flood of messages both from friends and strangers offering support and encouragement. Naomi sat next to me, her eyes wide as she saw the thousands of shares. "Dad, are they standing with us?" she asked. I smiled and placed my hand on her shoulder. "You see, when the truth is exposed, there will always be people who will speak up." Out there, Clara was certainly furious. I imagined her face when she saw my name flooding social media along with the words, "land theft." For years, she had lived in arrogance, using fear to impose rules on the resident. But this time, fear no longer stood with her. It turned against her. In the following days, reporters began appearing around the neighborhood. They came to interview me, to photograph the houses built on Ellington land. I didn't shy away, but I didn't seek the camera's spotlight either. I showed them the original document, letting them take their own photos and notes. I answered briefly, without embellishment. I wanted the public to see that this wasn't a staged performance, but an undeniable truth. Meanwhile, I heard that Clara was scrambling to find a lawyer, trying to block the information. She reached out to her trusted residents, pressuring them to write statements supporting the HOA. But the more she tried, the more she revealed her desperation. The residents began to doubt her. Those who had once avoided me now gave me a slight nod as they passed by. Some even whispered, "Marcus, you did the right thing." One night, I sat on the porch, the cool breeze from the lake blowing gently. I thought about everything that had just happened, about the quiet, powerful shift in public opinion. I didn't need to shout to defend myself. I only needed the truth, and once the truth is set free, it will find its way, like water in a dam, flowing quietly until, eventually, it sweeps away everything in its path. I knew Clara wasn't ready to give up. She would find ways to counterattack, launching more devious moves. But this time, the game had changed. She was no longer facing just me, but an entire community in outrage, thousands of eyes watching her every move. And I believed this was just the beginning. I folded the stack of papers neatly and carefully placed them in the metal box. Naomi was asleep in her room, her breathing steady. I sat in silence, feeling more at peace than ever. I knew my daughter had seen, had understood that the truth holds more power than any insult, and I understood that this fight had taken a major step forward. Clara Whitmore thought she was the law. From now on, the law would no longer stand with her. That day, the community hall was packed people. Clara Whitmore organized a press conference with all the fanfare, from the backdrop featuring the HOA logo to the luxurious rows of seats reserved for the press and invited residents. I stood among the crowd, watching as reporters readied their recorders and cameras, while Clara appeared like a seasoned politician. She wore a perfectly fitted suit, walking with confidence, her half smile as if stepping onto a stage. Clara spoke, each word carefully emphasized, as if rehearsed beforehand, all for the benefit of the community. Her voice echoed throughout the room, amplified by the microphones until it drowned out the murmurs of the crowd. She gestured toward the large images behind her, a rendering of the residential area, with well-built homes, a small park, and a sparkling lake. Every detail was crafted to embellish the lie that this was a noble project, the shared dream of the entire community. Polite applause followed. I looked around and could clearly see the forced expressions in many residents' eyes, but they still clapped, perhaps for the presence of the press, for Clara's authority, and maybe because they feared being targeted if they remained silent. She continued, her voice growing bolder. "We build to maintain standard, to protect the values of this neighborhood. If anyone feels out of place, it's because they don't understand the spirit of the community." I felt the blood boiling in my veins. Her hollow words were like a dull blade, cutting and scraping, rubbing salt into the wound. I stepped forward, to the astonishment of many. Just as Clara was about to raise her glass to pause for a moment, threw the original map onto the table in front of her. The dry sound of it hitting the surface made the entire room freeze in shock. "Community?" I spat, my eyes never leaving Clara's face. "This is my father's land. Every inch of this land is named Ellington. You talk about the community's benefit? No, you're lying blatantly to cover up your theft." The room fell deathly silent. A few reporters raised their cameras higher, and the lenses focused directly on me. I saw flashes from the cameras, heard the continuous click of recorders. Clara stood frozen for a moment but quickly regained her composure. She looked down at the map, then lifted her head, her eyes burning with fury. You think a few old papers will make anyone believe you? Clara snarled, her voice dropping low but sharp. Marcus, you're slandering the efforts of dozens of people who have worked to make this place a model community. You will kneel and apologize in front of everyone. I could hear the hiss in her voice, see her fingers gripping the glass so tightly it turned white, but I stood my ground. I took another step forward, looking directly into Clara's eyes, ensuring every reporter and every resident present that day could hear me. Kneel? I promised my father I would never bow before an abuser of power. You want me to kneel, but the only lever I'll pull is the one on that dam. And when I do, all your illegally built houses will turn to rubble. The murmurs exploded. Some residents gaped in disbelief, a few shook their heads, while the reporters scrambled to record every word. Clara stood frozen, forced smile flickering across her face before vanishing, replaced by a look of pure hatred. She tried to maintain composure, but the muscles in her face were taut with tension. One resident stood up, her voice trembling. If what Marcus is saying is true, have we been deceived all this time? That question was like a spark thrown into a barrel of oil. The room erupted in chatter, some pointing at Clara, others whispering to their neighbors. Clara raised her hand, trying to restore order, but the noise had already spiraled beyond control. I stood still. No need to say more. I knew I had achieved what I needed. Sometimes, a well-timed sharp word is more powerful than 1,000 pieces of evidence. I didn't need to shout to accuse Clara, for she had revealed her true face by losing her composure in front of the crowd. Finally, Clara slammed her hand on the table, her voice high and shrill. This is misinformation, plot to destroy me. I will sue you, Marcus Ellington, for defamation in public. But her voice trembled, no longer as sharp as it usually was. Threats rang hollow in the face of the skeptical eyes now focused on her. I looked at Clara, replying slowly, my voice cold and steady. Go ahead, Clara. I'm waiting. But when the court opens the files, you'll see everything you've been hiding exposed. And then, this community will ask you one simple question. Why build houses on Ellington land? She staggered slightly, trying to regain her imposing demeanor, but I could clearly see her confidence had been drained. The people around her no longer clapped in approval, but exchanged worried glances. I left the hall, walking down the long corridor, hearing the continuous buzz of conversation behind me. When I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cold air. It felt like I had just Clara off throne she had clung to for years. She might still have tricks up her sleeve, more schemes to play, but once the community had heard the truth, the silence of complicity began to crack. I didn't need to say anything more, for the public would handle the rest. That night, Naomi looked at me, her eyes shining brightly. Dad, I saw the video of you speaking at the press conference. Everyone is sharing it online. I believe we're going to win. I hugged her, feeling her warmth, and knew that this battle had entered a new chapter. Clara might still scream, but from today, she was no longer the only one holding the power to define community. The clip of the previous HOA meeting was uploaded by someone overnight, and in no time, it spread everywhere like wildfire. In the video, Clara Whitmore's face appeared clearly, her voice booming through the microphone, full of arrogance. This neighborhood is not for your kind of skin. In that moment, there was no longer any veil of pretense to hide behind. Her discriminatory words, every single one of them, hit the ears of thousands online like a slap to the community standards she had wrapped herself in. The comments flooded in rapidly, each line building on the last. How can someone be so unreasonable? Who does she think she is to say that? I can't believe this is America in the 21st century. I sat in the living room, Naomi beside me, her eyes wide, scrolling endlessly through the furious reaction. Some people even cut the clip, looping the exact line and adding bright red. Is this the HOA law? I didn't say anything, didn't comment, didn't share further. I chose silence because I knew that this outrage needed to be fed by the public. Each sarcastic remark, every line of anger, every share, was a hammer pounding against the wall of power Clara had built. I simply sat quietly, listening to the distant sound of keys being struck by people who had never met me, but who were now standing with me through their own outrage. The news began to explode. Some local TV channels clip as the subject of debate. The reporters solemnly read Clara's words, then left it to the viewers to draw their conclusion. Online, community pages were continuously sharing it, adding the question, if this is your HOA leader, what would you do? Tens of thousands responded, mostly with anger, and many claimed they had faced similar situations, being abused by HOAs, fined unfairly, belittled because of their skin color, background, or simply because they didn't fit in with the majority. I sat in the quiet house, listening as Naomi read aloud the supportive comments. Her voice was mixed with excitement, trembling. Dad, everyone is seeing the truth now. They're standing with us. I placed my hand on her shoulder and nodded gently. Don't get too excited, sweetheart. This anger needs to reach its peak. Only then will it be unstoppable. Clara, of course, didn't sit still. I heard that she quickly held an internal meeting and hired a PR firm to claim that the video had been edited, but those excuses didn't convince anyone. Once people people had heard her voice and seen her attitude firsthand, every explanation she gave only made her look more ridiculous. Some even made memes, placing Clara's face onto old propaganda posters with the mocking phrase, "I am the law." I let the wave continue to rise. I didn't need to defend myself or escalate things further. Social media had become the battleground, and Clara had made herself the target. Every angry comment, every call for her to be punished, was the hardest blow of all. As night fell, I stood on the porch, looking out over the dark yard. The wind from the lake blew cold and sharp. I could hear the insects chirping, the water softly lapping at the shore. But in my mind, those sounds merged with the clicking of keyboards, the anger of thousands of people turning toward Clara. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of waiting, like a storm that hadn't yet touched the ground. I knew, the more silent I stayed, the more that anger would intensify. The next day, the national media picked up the story. A major newspaper ran the headline, "HOA President Makes Public Racist Remarks at Community Meeting." The article quoted Clara's exact words, along with the outrage from the online community. Civil law experts were invited to comment on television, many asserting that Clara's actions and words could lead to serious lawsuits, potentially invalidating all of the HOA's decisions. Naomi looked at me, her eyes bright. "Dad, is everything really changing?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, remembering the fear and tears she had when her classmates teased her, then looked at the phone screen where thousands of strangers were condemning Clara. "Change will come," I said slowly, "but we must let it ripen." Clara tried to fight back. She sent an open letter to the residents, rambling on about misunderstandings, about community spirit. But those letters were immediately posted online and torn apart by thousands of mocking comments. "This is community spirit? Community spirit? Or racist spirit?" Every word Clara wrote fueled the flames of the outrage even more. I sat at the table, silent, offering no more words. I let that anger rise to its peak, because I knew, when the public had been pushed to its limit, any wrong move by Clara would be the final blow, and I didn't need to be the one holding the knife. That night, Naomi asked me, "Dad, people want to sue Clara, should we join in?" I looked at her, seeing the growing determination replacing the fear in her eyes. I smiled lightly, answering, "If it were you, what would you do? Stand in court to defend your honor, or stay silent and watch her bring disaster upon herself?" That question was also what I wanted to ask everyone following this story. If you were in my shoes, would you choose to sue Clara, or let her bring disaster upon herself? After several days of social media uproar over Clara Whitmore's racist remarks, the atmosphere in the lakeside community had changed completely. With each step I took, I could feel the two-way gaze. Some looked at me with sympathy and shame, while others stared with worry, as if afraid I would drag the whole community into an endless crisis. But what I observed most clearly was the growing divide within the HOA board. In the past, Clara only had to walk into a meeting room, and everyone would nod in agreement with whatever she said. That was no longer the case. I heard whispers when residents gathered in front of the school, during morning workouts by the lake, or even in the small grocery store at the end of the street. A middle-aged woman whispered to her neighbor, "What if Marcus is right? If the land really belongs to his family, then all of us have been living on a lie." The neighbor glanced around, lowered her voice, "Quiet, what if someone hears?" But their eyes no longer held the blind trust they once had. At the next HOA meeting, Clara arrived later than usual. She still carried herself with authority, her hair slicked back and her forced smile in place, but I could see the tension at the corners of her eyes. As she sat down in the chair at the head of the table, the room fell silent immediately. But today's silence wasn't the usual obedience, it was the heavy silence of doubt. Clara tapped lightly on the table, her voice steady. "I've heard some baseless rumors that the land ownership here is not legal. I assure you, everything was done according to the proper procedures, and there is no room for doubt." She paused, scanning the room, as if searching for anyone who might dare to disagree. From the middle row, an older man cleared his throat, and then spoke, his voice shaky but clear. "What if Marcus is right? He has the document. We've all seen them." The room erupted in murmurs, many heads lowering, some nodding slightly. Clara immediately straightened up, her eyes flashing, her hands clenched tightly. She slammed her hand down on the table, her voice sharp. "Anyone who betrays us will lose their HOA privileges. Let me be clear. Anyone who sides with Marcus Ellington will no longer receive maintenance services, will be excluded from community activities, and will be considered a disruptor of this community." Her threat landed like a heavy stone. Immediately, the room fell completely silent, not a sound to be heard. I saw eyes that had just flickered with doubt quickly lower to the ground. Fear once again tightened their throats, turning them into silent shadows under Clara's power. I sat in the back row, watching the scene unfold, and let out a dry laugh. I spoke, not loudly, but enough for it to echo throughout the room. "The tighter you squeeze, the more you bind yourself." Clara turned abruptly, her gaze sharp as a knife, but she didn't respond, because she knew that once those words had been spoken, they would haunt everyone present. I noticed a few residents glance at me, their eyes flashing with a mix of admiration and fear. They wanted to agree, but the chains Clara had placed on them were too tight. They weren't ready to stand up, but the crack was there. there, and nothing could hide it. When the meeting ended, I walked out slowly. I overheard whispers behind me. Marcus is right, but who dares to speak out more? Question hung in the air, unanswered, but I knew I had planted the seed. Outside the hall, Clara stood with a few loyal members, her face tense. She lowered her voice, but still loud enough for me to hear. We have to crush anyone who dares doubt us. If someone like Marcus is allowed to stand, this power is finished. Those around her nodded vigorously, but in their eyes, I saw the shadow of worry. I walked past them without stopping, casting a brief glance at Clara. She tried to maintain a challenging stare, but in that fleeting moment, I saw a crack in her iron mask. Clara was no longer as secure as before. She had resorted to blatant threat, which meant she knew her power's foundation was starting to crumble. That night, when I got home, Naomi rushed to me, face filled with concern. Dad, I heard some of my classmates say that the HOA will cut off our electricity and water if you keep resisting. Is that true? I bent down, looking into my daughter's anxious eyes, then replied calmly but firmly, Clara can threaten anyone, but I'm not afraid, and neither should you be. This land is ours. As long as we don't give up, she will be the one to lose everything. Naomi hugged me, her hand trembling, but I saw her gaze now filled with determination. That night, I sat alone at my desk. The land documents spread out before me. I remembered my father's word. The truth may be buried, but it doesn't die. It will sprout, and when it does, nothing can stop it. I smiled faintly, thinking back to the scene in the hall that afternoon. Clara had sown fear, but I had sown doubt, and doubt was the seed that would destroy her power. In the darkness, I thought about the dam. The water still quietly gathered behind it, patient and silent, waiting for the strength to overflow. Clara was doing the same, compressing the residents, tightening her grip with threat. But she forgot that the more she squeezed, the more violently the water would break through, and when that moment came, no one would be able to save her. In the days that followed, I started receiving anonymous messages from some resident. They wrote, "We know you're telling the truth, but we can't stand up yet. Please be patient." Another person left a note in my mailbox. "We support you. Don't give up." I held these messages, feeling the clear sense that the rift within the HOA had become a tear that could never be mended. Clara still held power, but that power now resembled a cracked wall, just waiting for a strong wind to bring it down. And I knew that day was drawing near. I didn't need to rush. I only needed to stand firm because day by day, she was tightening the ropes around herself, threats that even the residents were starting to grow weary of. I looked out at the lake, the water shimmering under the moonlight. I thought about my father, about Naomi, about everything Clara had taken. I took a deep breath, silently telling myself, once the seed is planted, the harvest comes, and when that day comes, Clara Whitmore will be the one to kneel. In the tense days that followed, as the story of Clara's discrimination continued to rage across social media, another seed of rumor began to leak and spread like thin wisps of smoke. First, it only appeared in hushed conversations outside the grocery store, during morning exercise sessions around the lake, or when residents were walking their dogs. "He still controls the old dam," a lowered voice whispered. Immediately, curious glances were exchanged, and the two people quickened their pace as if afraid of being overheard. Before long, the rumor was repeated enough times to become a lingering obsession in the air of the community. It was said that the dam, long forgotten, still legally belonged to the Ellington family, that the key to the sluice gate was still in my hand, and that with a single pull of the lever, all 35 houses built on disputed land would turn to mud. I neither confirmed nor denied it. Every time I heard those whispers, I simply smiled faintly, letting people's imaginations inflate the story. I knew well that once a rumor took root, it often became stronger than any evidence. It sowed fear in people's heart, and from that fear, Clara's power would begin to erode. One afternoon, as I walked past the community hall, a group of residents was gathered, talking in hushed tones. When I appeared, they fell silent, their eyes quickly shifting away, but I could see the confusion clearly written on their faces. I didn't need to say anything. I just nodded lightly in greeting and walked on. That silence, to me, was worth more than 1,000 affirmations. Of course, Clara had heard the rumor. In a brief meeting, she sat at the head of the table, her gaze cold. When a resident asked point blank, "Is it true Marcus still holds key to the dam?" Clara laughed dismissively, her voice laced with bitterness. "Just a scare tactic. That dam is old and no one cares about it anymore. Don't let baseless rumors cause you fear." She spoke clearly and decisively, but even then, I saw her hand slam down on the table, as if trying to reassure herself. I chose that moment to step forward, slowly but firmly, causing the entire room to fall silent. I approached Clara, leaned slightly toward her ear, and in a cold voice whispered, "This rumor will take your whole house down." I saw Clara's entire body stiffen. She tried to sit up straighter, her lips curling into a forced smile, but her eyes betrayed her with a brief flash of panic. Her pupils dilated for a moment before she quickly snapped them shut behind her cold exterior. I could see clearly, despite her effort to appear calm, fear had seeped into every vein in her body. The residents around us couldn't hear what I whispered, but they saw the change that passed over Clara's face. Her usual calm demeanor cracked, revealing a small fissure. And for those who already had doubt, that single crack was enough for them to blow up the rumor into undeniable. That night, Naomi sat on the sofa, staring at me. "Dad, can you really open the dam?" I looked at her, seeing the mixed curiosity and worry in her eyes. I didn't answer directly. I simply said, "Sometimes, to win, you don't need to reveal the whole truth. You just need to let your enemy imagine the worst." Naomi fell silent, but her face gradually relaxed, understanding that my silence was part of the plan. The next day, I passed a group of young residents in the neighborhood. One of them, seemingly braver than the rest, asked loudly, "Mr. Marcus, is it true that you'll open the dam if they don't stop?" I stopped, looked him in the eye, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds. Then I smiled faintly and replied, "What do you think?" The question back caused the group to fall silent, but their eyes burned with both doubt and fear. The rumor spread further, beyond the confines of the neighborhood. Journalists, who had been closely following the land grab and racism story, began mentioning the dam card as a new element. Some articles read, "The Ellington family has a history of controlling the lakeside dam." True, this could be the card that drives the HOA to the brink. The more people discussed it, the more I saw Clara growing uneasy. She began appearing more frequently, trying to hold meetings to reassure the resident. In one of them, I saw her with a microphone, her voice loud and firm. "This is not true. Marcus Ellington is spreading false rumors to cause trouble." But every time she denied it, I saw more and more skeptical eyes. The residents no longer believed every word she said, like they once did. One day, I happened to run into her in the hallway after a meeting. There was no crowd, no cameras, just me and Clara. She looked at me, her eyes flashing with anger, her voice lowered. "You think a few silly rumors can take me down?" I answered succinctly, without emphasis. "I don't need to say anything more. You've already taken yourself down by letting everyone see you tremble." She was silent, her lips tightly pressed, before turning and walking away, her heels striking the floor with a heavy sound. The residents whispered more and more among themselves. Some began discussing what would happen if the dam were really open. A man in the coffee shop said, "If the dam breaks, those houses are gone." Another replied, "I don't think he'd actually do it, but who knows?" The conversation left the table silent, their eyes meeting each other with tension. I didn't engage, but each time I heard it, I could feel the weight the rumor had gathered. I didn't need to confirm it. It was enough to push Clara into a position where she had to strain herself to deny it. And the more she denied, the more her unease showed. Naomi asked me once more, her voice filled with worry, "Dad, if you really do it, where will things go?" I looked at her, answering slowly, "Things have already gone too far to turn back, but we don't need to rush. Let them destroy themselves with their fear first." As night fell, I walked to the lake's edge, looking toward the dam, dark and silent in the shadows. The sound of the water echoed steadily, like the heavy heartbeat of the path. I knew it was still there, steadfast and patient, and I also knew that with just a small move, everything would change. But I didn't need to do anything yet, because the rumor had already done the heaviest lifting for me. It had planted the seed of obsession in Clara's mind, doubt in the resident's heart, created an image in the public's eye of a man who would not kneel, one ready to use the very power of nature to reclaim justice. In the silence, I smiled faintly. The rumor had become truth in the eyes of many, and for me, that was enough. I turned away and headed back home, ready for the next step in this fight, because I knew, as long as the water remained dammed, the day it would overflow was not far off. Before the rumors about the dam had even settled, another piece of news hit this time. Not a rumor, but the truth, clear as the red-stamped letters on a document. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer, Mr. Harlan, who had been my trusted advisor since the beginning of this ordeal. His voice was steady but barely concealed his excitement. "Marcus, we've found what she's been trying to hide at all costs. Clara used your family's land, the land she illegally took as collateral to borrow millions of dollars from a commercial bank." I paused for a few seconds, then asked him to send over the entire file. When the stack of documents placed on my desk, I opened each page, my eyes glued to the numbers, signatures, and stamp. Everything was so clear, it couldn't be disputed. Clara Whitmore had used bank loans to build the residential area, with the Ellington property as collateral. She had turned my family's land into a stepping stone to inflate her own power, then publicly declared that I had no place here. I read the signature section over and over again, where Clara's handwriting appeared sloppy but still unmistakably familiar. A mix of anger and satisfaction rose within me. For years, she had confidently believed she was the law, that nothing could touch her. But now, she had tied the legal noose around her own neck, and all I needed to do was pull lightly for it to tighten. I let out a low, rumbling laugh, echoing through the quiet room. "She's tied the noose herself," I muttered, as if speaking directly to Clara through the invisible distance. Naomi heard the laugh and walked into the room with a curious look. I handed her the stack of documents to look at. She glanced at the words, not fully understanding, but her eyes lit up when I explained. "You see, not only did she steal the land, but she also used it to borrow money for construction. construction. Everything she's flaunting out there is built on lies. Naomi whispered softly. So, if the dam breaks, all those houses will lose their value, right, Dad? I nodded. She fell silent, then took my hand tightly. Then we won't have to be afraid anymore. While I calmly sat reading through each line of the document, Clara, across the neighborhood, seemed to be losing her usual air of confidence. I heard from a few residents that, in a private meeting, when this news was leaked, she became so angry that her hands trembled, her face turned pale, and she had to lean on the table to steady herself. She ordered her personal lawyer to find a way to cover it up, but it was all in vain. Once the mortgage documents were filed with the bank and notarized, there was no way to erase the evidence. I imagined her sitting there, her hands trembling uncontrollably, fake smile gradually crumbling. All that she had once considered her strength, all that she had used to threaten me and the residents, now turned out to be a castle built on sand. I didn't need to yell at her because these documents had already spoken for me. The next day, I took copies of the documents to some residents who still had doubt. I didn't need to persuade them much. I simply showed them quietly. When they saw the bank stamp, the millions of dollars in debt, their expressions changed. A middle-aged man held the paper, trembling, muttering, "So, we've been living on land that she mortgaged." A woman sighed. "If that's the case, then all of us are just pawns in her game." Soon after, the information leaked to the press. A headline read, "HOA President Clara Whitmore mortgaged disputed land to borrow millions." The article detailed every line of the file. Social media exploded once again, people sharing it widely and commenting in droves. Clara had been seen as a racist before, now she was exposed further. A greedy abuser of power, using manipulation to profit at the expense of others. In my home, I sat watching the flood of news stories fill my screen. I didn't speak, didn't comment, didn't need to appear in front of cameras. The truth had come to light on its own. What I had said before, my warnings about Clara's arrogance, were now proven with undeniable evidence. That night, I went back to the lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, the surface smooth as a mirror, but I knew that beneath that stillness lay an unstoppable force. I thought about the dam, the water still steadily building up day and night. If one day I really pulled the lever, not only would those 35 houses be submerged, Clara's years of power-building dreams would turn to dust. And the bitter truth was, she had made that asset her burden, the very proof against herself. In the darkness, I let out a soft laugh, a cold, detached smile. Clara Whitmore once looked at me and said, "Here, I am the law." But today, the bank documents proved that the real law was no longer on her side. She could be angry enough, tremble, she could threaten, she could flail, but it wouldn't change the fact that it was her own hands that had written her verdict. I returned home, feeling lighter than ever. Naomi was waiting in the living room, rushing over to hug me. "Dad, they can't deny it anymore, right?" I nodded, feeling the warmth of my daughter, knowing I had taken another significant step in this fight. Clara might still hold power on paper within the HOA, but in the eyes of the community, she had lost everything. And from now on, whenever she looked at me, she would know that nothing could shield her from the truth. I was sitting in my office, the stack of mortgage documents that lawyer Harlan had just sent over still spread out on the desk. The desk lamp cast a weary yellow light on the clearly printed words, confirming the truth that Clara Whitmore had turned my family's land into a pawn in her power game. Everything was so clear, there was no denying it. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, feeling the weight, but also a sense of satisfaction. Just then, a sharp knock echoed through the room. Before I could react, the door flew open, and Clara stormed in like a hurricane. Her face was flushed with anger, her once neatly styled hair now in disarray, her eyes gleaming with panic. Her hands shook as she pointed at me, her voice raw and hoarse from shouting, "You've destroyed everything." I lifted my head and met her gaze, my calmness in stark contrast to the fury crashing down on me. Slowly, I stood up, pushed my chair back into place, placed both hands firmly on the desk, emphasizing every word. "I'm just taking back my land." The moment the words left my mouth, Clara erupted. She slammed her hand down on the desk, files scattering, papers flying to the floor. Her voice was shrill, filled with a mixture of desperation and hatred. "You'll burn in hell, Marcus. You'll be crushed by the very thing you're awakening." I didn't look away, didn't flinch from her shouting. In her eyes, I saw not only rage, but also fear, the fear of being exposed, of losing her power, of watching her false kingdom crumble before her. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, and spoke each word clearly, my voice as cold as a blade. "I'll send you ahead of me." In that moment, Clara took half a step back, as if struck directly in the chest. She tried to regain her defiant posture, but I saw her lips quiver, her hand still gripping the edge of the desk for balance. Naomi rushed into the room from the living room, stopping in her tracks when she saw the scene. I gestured for her to remain silent. Clara glanced briefly at Naomi, then turned back to me, as if searching for a crack to strike back. But all she had now was the stark vulnerability she could no longer hide. "I've built this place with blood, sweat, and my reputation," Clara snarled, but the certainty in her tone had faded. "Do you think a few bank loan papers can bring me down? I still have power, Marcus. And I will crush you until you no longer exist in the eyes of this community. I let out a dry laugh, bent down to pick up the scattered papers, and neatly placed them back on the desk. I didn't need to shout louder than she did because the truth was already speaking for me. You call this blood? This effort? All I see is greed dressed in the cloak of community. You sold your soul for numbers, and now you panic as you see the noose tightening around your neck. Clara stepped back, her eyes flashing with despair. I knew she had realized that this battle was no longer under her control. Her sudden appearance at my house was proof of her defeat. A person who wields absolute power would never lower themselves to visit their enemy's doorstep. Naomi gently grasped my hand, her eyes filled with worry. I reassured her with a nod. Then, I looked at Clara one last time, my voice firm. You want to drag me to hell, but you are the one sinking into it. I won't stop you. I will just stand and watch, ensuring you sink deeper than anyone else. Clara took a deep breath, then turned on her heel and walked out. She opened the door, stepped outside, but not without throwing one last venomous remark. Don't too happy, Marcus. I still have cards left to play. The door slammed shut, leaving behind the sharp scent of her perfume and a heavy atmosphere in the room. Naomi sat down, her voice trembling. Dad, is there really anything else she can do? I looked at her, smiled reassuringly, and said, don't worry, the more she struggles, the more she reveals her weaknesses, and when everyone sees it, no one will believe her anymore. I sat down, my eyes on the stack of papers neatly placed on the desk. The truth had been uncovered, and Clara knew it. She could scream, threaten, but she couldn't undo the stamped words in the bank record. Everything she did now only highlighted the image of a desperate person, pushed to the brink. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the cool breeze from the lake brushing against me. I thought about my father, about the days he took me to the dam, explaining the power of water. Water can sustain life, Marcus, but when it's held back too long, it will sweep away everything in its path, and you must know when to open the way for it. I smiled in the darkness. Clara thinks I'm the destroyer, but in reality, she's the one who built the dam of lie. I just need to wait. Flood of truth will break it down. The next day, the news of Clara's mortgage loan spread even further. The media didn't stop digging into the story, with legal experts commenting enthusiastically. Some TV channels even aired copies of the documents, reading each line as if it were an official indictment. Residents began discussing it openly, no longer whispering in secrecy. Some even stood in front of the community hall, loudly declaring, "We've all been deceived, and she still dares to lecture us on morality?" Clara appeared at the emergency meeting, face pale, her eyes wavering. She tried to regain her authority, her voice hoarse, but still loud. All that news is fabricated. Marcus has made this up to sabotage the community. But as soon as she finished speaking, a resident raised a copy of the documents and shouted, "Then what is this? Who signed this? If it's not you, then who?" The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Clara turned pale, her mouth opened, but she couldn't say a word. That was the moment I knew, no matter how she struggled, truth had already dragged her into the mud. That evening, when I returned home, Naomi sat beside me, holding my hand tightly. "Dad, I saw it. She can't hide it anymore. I believe, this time, she won't get away." I hugged her, looking out at the dark, still lake. In my mind, I heard the words I had said yesterday. "I'll send you ahead of me." Clara might not have given up, but I knew that ticket had already been printed with her name, and the train without brakes was waiting at the end of the line. The hearing that day took place in an atmosphere of tension. The city court, where Clara Whitmore and I stood facing each other, had become the deciding ground for everything. The stern faces of the judges sitting high on their benches, surrounded by lawyers, witnesses, and everyone present in the courtroom, all quietly observed. The room seemed to resonate with nothing but the sound of the judge's gavel, punctuating each statement to ensure no detail was overlooked. I stood on the right side, alongside my lawyer, Harlan. In my hand were the irrefutable pieces of evidence, the official documents proving ownership of the land, old land maps, and documents proving Clara had used my family's land as collateral for a loan. Everything was so clear it couldn't be denied. Opposite me, Clara sat, her hands tightly clasped, her face straining to hide the tension. She maintained her confident exterior, but I knew deep down, she realized that the truth was slowly slipping out of her control. The trial began, and the judge instructed my lawyer to present the evidence. Harlan stood up, holding the stack of papers, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the court. "We have gathered all the necessary documentation to prove that the land Clara Whitmore and the HOA occupy is the legitimate property of the Ellington family. Here are the copies of the ownership documents, the old land map, as well as documents showing that this land was never transferred to the HOA." Harlan presented everything in a logical manner, each sheet placed on the table like stepping stones. I observed Clara's reaction, but she remained silent, her eyes glued to the documents. She knew that once everything was laid out so plainly, there was no turning back. Yet, she stayed there, her expression as if trying to muster every last ounce of strength to mount a counterattack. attack. When my lawyer finished, the judge turned to Clara and asked her to respond. Clara stood up, adjusted her dress, and walked to the opposing table. Her voice rang out, trying to mask her unease. I did everything for the benefit of the community. We built this residential area to improve the quality of life, to provide a better place to live for all the residents. She paused for a moment, looking around the room, seemingly gauging the reactions of those present. I did not take the land illegally. Everything was approved with the consent of the majority. Clara's voice no longer held the certainty it once did. It was no longer the voice of someone in power, but of someone desperately trying to maintain an image. Everything she said lacked conviction, just a desperate attempt to hold on to what was already starting to crack. I didn't sit in silence as she had hoped. My eyes never left Clara, and I stood up, my voice not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear. What community? This is Ellington land. This land has always belonged to my family. Each word I spoke, Clara, like waves crashing against the shore. I could feel the silence around me, but I wasn't afraid. All the evidence was there, truth had been laid out, and now I just needed to ask the final question. Who was really in the wrong? Clara ground her teeth, her face paling for a moment, but she refused to back down, immediately countering. Marcus, you don't understand. I'm doing this for the benefit of the community. I've brought a modern neighborhood with all the amenities for everyone. Don't let a few ridiculous papers decide everything. Her voice faltered in desperation. The whole room fell silent again. Only the steady breathing of those watching could be heard. Clara was no longer the powerful queen in the eyes of the residents. She was just a person sinking deeper into her own dissatisfaction. I didn't need to say anything more. Everything was clear. Everyone could see Clara's discomfort. A few residents began to look at each other, their gazes no longer filled with blind respect. A man stood up, not looking at Clara but turning to the judge, his voice no longer filled with doubt. He's right. This is Mr. Ellington's land, and if Clara mortgaged it without his family's approval, then she must be held accountable. The judge didn't rush to make a ruling. He sat quietly, his chin resting on his hand, thinking in silence. Clara stood still, but her hands clenched tightly, her throat choking, unable to say anything more. She knew she had lost. Her words now were just an empty shell, incapable of saving anything. The trial continued for a few more hours, but I didn't hear anything important anymore. All the evidence had been presented clearly, and I knew Clara couldn't salvage the situation. I just stood there, my eyes still fixed on her. Clara had lost all confidence and power, and she knew that without the acknowledgement of me and the residents, she could do nothing to keep the land she had taken. Finally, the trial ended. The judge dropped his gavel and announced that further investigation would be needed regarding Clara's illegal use of the land, requesting more time to review the evidence. But I knew everything was almost settled. I had achieved my goal, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the final verdict. I walked out of the courthouse, feeling an unusual sense of relief. Naomi was waiting for me at the door, her eyes shining. Dad, I believe we're going to win. I bent down, looked at her, and smiled. Yes, Naomi, we will win. I knew Clara wouldn't stop, but this time, it was her own overwhelming ambition that had destroyed her, and all I needed to do was stand firm, stay true to my ideals, and let the truth prevail. The trial ended in a heavy atmosphere, the courtroom eerily quiet, with only the sound of footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. The judge's verdict rang out clearly in the silence. The HOA has violated the land ownership rights of the Ellington family. However, dismantling and returning the land will require additional time to fully carry out. It was a preliminary decision, like a starting point for the lengthy legal battle I had anticipated. While it was an initial victory, in my heart, there was a sense of caution, feeling that this was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and hardship. Naomi sat beside me, her hand tightly gripping mine, her eyes filled with a mix of worry and hope. I looked into those eyes, nodding slightly, a small gesture, but one that carried a deep understanding between us. Both of us knew that, although the court had declared Clara in the wrong, this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I could feel the tension in Naomi, but I also saw her determination, as if saying, no matter how long this battle may last, we wouldn't stop here. The court had ruled Clara wrong, but we knew that just one more step, and the government would get involved, and important decisions would be made. However, none of us could forget one thing. Clara was not one to give up easily. With her power and influence, she was used to forcing others to submit, and I was sure she would not let this case end so simply. That was what kept me from breathing a sigh of relief. When the trial ended, I walked out with Naomi. The sunlight still shone brightly, but in my heart, the lingering tension from the moments of hearing the verdict remained. Even though she had failed today, I knew Clara would not give up, and as we walked out of the courtroom, I felt a shadow pass behind me. It was Clara. She stood at the door, her gaze full of defiance, as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she just stood there, silent. After everyone had left, Clara approached me, her anger radiating from her. Her gaze seemed like it could burn me, and her words were as cold and sharp as a knife. You won a round, but you haven't won the whole game. Don't think that just because the court has temporarily declared you the winner, you can take this land back. I won't stop here, Marcus. She looked at me with a chilling stare, but I felt no fear. That feeling only made me want to face her even more resolutely. I stood firm, facing Clara, not backing down in in the slightest. She was used to people bowing to her power, but today, I was the one standing opposite her, unshaken, calmly responding. The final battle will come sooner than you think. I didn't need to say anything more, leaving those words to echo in the air like a declaration of war. Clara stood still, her cold gaze piercing, but she didn't say a word, as if my words had severed all her hope. But Clara was not one to give up easily, and her anger was rising to a boiling point. After Clara left, I walked back to my car, my emotions mixed. Although I had won in court today, I knew the fight wasn't over. The truth had come to light, but I also knew the price would be high. Clara wasn't someone who would quit easily, and I understood she would do whatever it took to protect what she had taken, whether through power or any other means. This made me prepare myself for the next steps, knowing new challenges would soon arise on this path. With every step I took, I wasn't just fighting for the Ellington family's rights, but for the other residents who had suffered from the HOA's abuse of power, those whom Clara and her minions had trampled on in the shadows, where no one could speak out, where no one could resist. I knew I was exposing the truth, but I also knew that once I was in this, there was no turning back. I couldn't just stand by as everything around me collapsed. Naomi didn't say anything after the trial, but I could sense hope growing in her eye. Though there was still some worry, I knew deep down that Naomi realized we had done something significant, and the hope for justice had been rekindled. However, I also couldn't forget that Clara was still reaching for power, unwilling to give up the game, and that made me even more determined. I couldn't stop halfway, couldn't let Clara or anyone else stand in my way. The anger inside me was no longer meaningless frustration. It had transformed into a resolute, unwavering determination. I wasn't just fighting for fairness for my family, but for all those who had endured oppression from the HOA. To reclaim what was rightfully ours, I would continue forward, never stopping, never giving up. I knew this battle would be long and hard. Clara wouldn't let go easily, and she would cling to everything she had to regain control, but I wouldn't let that happen. I was strong enough to face any challenge, and I would not back down. The road ahead would be tough, but I believed that, in the end, justice would prevail, and I would not stop until Clara and the HOA paid for what they had done. When I returned home, the rain had already started to fall. The raindrops gently tapped on the window, leaving long streaks in the dim light of the street lamp. I looked out the window, feeling the silence that enveloped everything, but inside me, a sense of determination surged. This was the moment I asserted my power, not just against Clara, but against anyone who sought to infringe upon justice and my right. I looked at Naomi and saw her smile when I walked in. Though there was still some worry in her eyes, I knew she was proud of what I had done. And I made a promise to myself that I would never let Clara or anyone else overshadow my family again. The rain continued to fall, but within me, fire had been lit. I knew this fight wouldn't end until Clara and the HOA paid for their wrongdoing. And I would never give up, for justice and for the people I love. The evening rain fell soft, but it couldn't erase the heaviness in the air. I stepped outside, walking along the dirt path that led to the lake, a place that was not just peaceful but also a key part of the plan I had been preparing for months. The old dam, which seemed to have been forgotten, was now the final weapon in my hand. This dam, built by my father over 30 years ago, wasn't a monumental structure, but it had been crucial in preserving the irrigation system for the fields and regulating the water supply for the entire area. Anyone who lived here knew its importance. It was a place I had turned to over the years during storms, whenever my heart was filled with anger and I needed to do something to release it. But today, I wasn't here to seek peace. I was here to prepare for the final battle. Climbed the old stone step, each step sounding a dry echo. How long had it been since I last came up here? How long had this dam stood silent, untouched? But today, I wasn't here just to look. I was here to open the door that Clara Whitmore and the HOA carelessly closed in their arrogance. I stood before the iron gate, gently brushing the rusted lock that had weathered the years. The feeling was strained, as if I were caressing old memories, the years when everything was intact before others had invaded. I bent down, my eyes resting on the markings on the iron's surface, the scars left by time. I no longer felt fear or worry, only a resolve I had never known before. Memories of my father, of the day he stood beside this dam, teaching me how water must be controlled, how storms could destroy but also preserve life, surged within me once more. The water behind the dam was rising slowly, like the anger I had swallowed over so many years. With each day, each month, I felt myself being pushed farther from my father's land, overshadowed by the false power of Clara and her cronies. Every time I saw the houses springing up on my family's land, every time I thought of her words, "You are nothing here," fury inside me ignited again. And now, everything was in place for me to use this very water to crush her ambition. I stood there, in the stillness, hearing the steady flow of water, as if nothing had changed. But I knew that behind the iron wall, a tremendous force was waiting for its command. That force was not just water, but the years I had spent in resignation, in the silence that they had forced me to keep. And now, all of it would be set free. I whispered, not for anyone to hear but for myself. The time will come when the water will speak for me. That was a promise I had made to myself, promise to those who had suffered under the injustice, the abuse of power by the HOA for so long. Everything would end, and people would know that not everything could be bought with power or money. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in the things that have been buried but still endure. The evening shadow began to fall over the lake, casting pale orange streaks across the surface, like a scene both romantic and haunting. I stood there, staring at the calm water, but inside me, fierce undertow raged. The decision I had been waiting for, the final step, was now only a flick of the switch away. I knew that when the water broke through the dam, it wouldn't just be Clara's houses or the HOA that would be swept away, but everything they had built on the lies. I reached out, my hand resting on the lever, but I didn't pull it just yet. Everything had to be perfectly prepared. Even though my anger made me want to act immediately, I had to make sure that every move was carefully calculated. Every second, every minute, I thought of all that I had lost, all that I needed to reclaim, and when I pulled that lever, it would not only resolve a small issue, but send a larger message, a message that I would never bow to those who abuse power. Time passed, and I still stood there, my hand firmly on the lever. The shadow deepened, and the water continued to rise. Little by little, I knew that the moment of my decision was near. The rustling of the wind through the trees, the soft waves lapping against the shore, filled the air. In that moment, I felt as though everything was coming together. I couldn't turn back. I couldn't retreat. I had come too far, and now, the price Clara would pay would not only be the loss of power, but the truth she had tried to conceal. I didn't need to look back anymore. I knew Clara wouldn't stop here. She would find a way to fight back, to hide behind lies, but it would all be in vain. The power she had, the supporters behind her, would mean nothing when faced with the truth, and I would be the one to bring that truth to light. Now was the time for me to make the decision. I turned to look at the dam, my eyes shining with a determined light. I reached out, once again gripping the lever, and I didn't hesitate. When I pulled it, it wouldn't just be the water, but everything Clara had built that would collapse. And that was when I could finally breathe easy, because I knew, in the end, justice would prevail. The party that Clara organized took place on a scorching afternoon, with the sun still halfway up in the sky, casting pale yellow light through the columns of the hall, creating long streaks on the ground. The entire lakeside area seemed to be immersed in music, the sounds of laughter echoing from the stage. Clara and her inner circle gathered. Figures passed by, dressed in fine attire, wine glasses in hand. Everything looked like a painting of luxury that I would never be able to touch if I stayed silent. But today, I wasn't here to blend in with that false joy. I was here to witness the true face of those who had taken over my life. Clara, with her smug smile, stood at the center of the crowd, raising her glass high, as if she were the queen in her palace. "We still control everything," Clara declared, her voice echoing through the sound system. Applause immediately followed by hearty laughter from those I knew for sure did not understand the truth of how this power had come to be. She spoke as if everything was in her hand, as if all the land, all the houses, and all the lives around her could only exist under the control of Clara Whitmore. I stood at a distance, silently, from a hidden corner, where no one could recognize my presence. The laughter from the party only made me feel the arrogance and shamelessness of it all. Everything around me was filled with falsehoods. Each laugh, every exchanged glance, all laced pretense, and all of it built on the land that I, Marcus Ellington, had once inherited from my father. They had no idea that the land beneath their feet was mine, that the houses they lived in, the places they celebrated, were all pieces of land seized unjustly, ruthlessly, and shamelessly. Clara might think she had won, that she could control everything, but she had no idea that her very actions had awakened within me power that could never be extinguished. At that moment, I didn't want to rush into an argument with her, nor did I want to leave this place hastily. I stood there, clenched, my eyes still fixed on that lavish party. Every laugh, every word from Clara felt like invisible knives cutting into me, into my family, into everything we had fought to preserve. But I also knew I couldn't allow myself to be swept up in their games. I didn't come here to witness the victory of an abuser of power, but to prove that even someone who has been trampled can rise again. I clenched my fist, my mind no longer focused on the party. The only thought in my heart was this: the moment of the final act was drawing near. In the past few days, I had prepared thoroughly, not for an immediate confrontation, but to find the exact moment when Clara would be helpless, unable to fight. I knew that one day, when everyone saw the truth, people like Clara would have to pay, and I would be the one standing there, saying little, waiting for the conclusion. I turned my back and left the party without Clara or anyone noticing. I didn't need the crowd's support. I didn't need their applause. All I needed was the truth, and the truth would have more power than all the lies she was putting on display. In the darkness of the neighborhood, I could feel the gradual change starting to take shape, like a wave silently waiting to break free. The next day, I decided to do something I had never considered before. I would bring everything to light, let the whole area know what Clara Whitmore had done with my family's land. I began gathering documents, old photographs, building plans, and evidence I could use to confront her. Clara's party was just a game, but that game couldn't go on forever. Naomi, seeing me working harder than ever, began to understand what was happening. "Dad, what are you going to do next?" I looked at my daughter, her eyes eyes filled with both concern and the same resolve I had seen in myself. "We won't stand still. I will fight, and I will win." I gently patted her on the shoulder, reassuring her that our family would not be defeated. As I continued working, preparing each step to bring Clara to light, I started to notice a small but important change. The people who had once been silent now began whispering, exchanging doubtful glances. They no longer looked Clara with fear, but with suspicion. The power she had built was now slowly crumbling, and I was the one pushing that crumbling forward. One evening, after Clara's party had ended, I stood by the lake again, gazing at the shimmering surface of the water. The drops in the lake, like the emotions inside me, quietly flowing. But no one knew they were about to overflow. Clara thought she had control over everything, that she could manipulate everyone, but she was wrong. Everything would end the way I had planned, and I would be the one standing up, ensuring she would never have the chance to rule again. I know the moment of the final act is near. I've prepared everything. Now all that's left is to wait. Clara can smile, she can be smug, but I will show her that this game was never in her hand. In just a moment, everything she thought was solid will shatter. With every step I take, I feel the end approaching more clearly. The confrontations of the past have taught me that sometimes silence and patience are the most powerful weapon. And now, Clara Whitmore will understand that. When her wall of power crumbles, nothing will be able to save her. That morning, I stood at my desk, faint light from the window, casting a soft glow on the papers in front of me. In the quiet space, the silence seemed to highlight the swirling thoughts in my mind. Fatigue, frustration, and tension overwhelmed me, but in that very moment, I realized that I was closer than ever to the ending I had long awaited. All I could think about was Clara, the woman I had once respected, but now, all that remained was anger and determination in my heart. The power game she had played for so long, the lies, the subtle manipulations, it was all about to end. And now, I felt as though an invisible force was guiding me, urging me to act. There was no turning back anymore. I sat down, beginning to type on the computer screen. My fingers moved gently, but every word had a clear, sharp purpose. No more vague or convoluted words. I had to be clear, not allowing Clara to avoid or counter my words. Leave, or the water will speak. Simple, concise, yet containing everything I wanted to say. A warning, strong enough Clara to understand that the time had come for her to face the consequences of her actions. I no longer wanted to waste time in pointless argument. All the truth, all her lies had been exposed, but she remained stubborn, refusing to let go. If that was the case, I wouldn't let her continue to outmaneuver me. We had reached the point of no return. The dam had raised the water high, and a simple shift would change everything. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Clara wasn't someone who would easily relinquish power. She had lived for years under the glow of dominance, never thinking she might lose everything. But I no longer had time to wait. My patience had run dry. The silence I had maintained wasn't surrender. It was the time I had spent preparing for today. It was time to make a decisive move, to act, and this time, no one could stop me. As I sat there, my eyes fixed on the screen, the thoughts continued to swirl in my mind. The price Clara would pay was not just for the land, nor the relations she had built over the years. It was for her power, her arrogance, the very thing she thought could buy everything. But Clara didn't understand. Not everything could be controlled with money. And the most important thing was, she had chosen the wrong person to challenge. This time, I wasn't a pawn in her game. I was the one leading the charge, and she was being deceived without even realizing it. After sending the email, I stood up and walked outside. The morning breeze swept through, bringing the freshness of a new day, but there was something unusual in the air, as if the universe was waiting for a significant event to unfold. The silence that enveloped the space felt heavy, and I could sense the world was bracing for a storm. Clara would not remain silent forever. She would react, and when she did, I would be ready. I had prepared for every possible scenario a long time ago. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for Clara to see what she would do. The only question was, would Clara face the truth, or would she continue hiding in the lies she had spun? Not long after, I received a reply from Clara. The message was brief, conveyed the contempt in her words. "Do it, if you dare." That phrase, seemingly just a challenge, carried arrogance and self-satisfaction, marking the turning point I had been waiting for. Clara had no idea she was cornering herself. She didn't know that she had lost control of the situation. In her eyes, I might have been just a weak pawn, but she didn't realize that I had already defeated her long ago. Every step I took, every decision I made, now was just that of a winner. With a faint smile, I placed my hand on the lever. The coolness of the metal seeped into my palm, a chilling sensation that brought absolute calm. I felt a massive wave was about to rise, ready to engulf everything that had been built on lies. Clara didn't know that by challenging me, she had entered a game I had prepared long ago. I nodded, gripping the lever tightly. Nothing could stop me now. Everything was set, and nothing could change it. The scene before me was now only water and rubble, destruction and desolation. The houses Clara thought she could control forever, the legacy she had built from deceit and manipulation, would now be swept away, and she would have nothing left to hide her actions. Clara might think she was still controlling the game, but she didn't know that I had already beaten her long ago. Every step I took now was merely the final move in a game that had been decided long before. I stood there, in silence, without a word, letting the tension in the air resolve itself. Everything I had done, everything I had prepared, was now ready. And now, there was only one question left to answer. Would Clara dare face the truth, or would she continue running in the lies created? She certainly wouldn't give up easily, nor would she accept truth without resistance. But I was no longer afraid. I had prepared myself for this moment long ago. This wasn't just about justice, it was about honor, about the right to live in my own truth. I didn't give up when they thought I would, and I won't stop until Clara and those backing her are held accountable for their actions. The anger within me is no longer a senseless outburst. It has transformed into an unwavering resolve, unchangeable. Clara won't win easily, because she was wrong the moment she first crossed me, and when I pull the lever, she'll realize that her threats and arrogance were merely a noose tightening around her. Now, I only need one moment, a moment that will last forever, the moment I've been waiting for. When I pull the lever, the water won't wash away the houses, but everything she has built on a foundation of lie, and once the water speaks, nothing will be able to stop it. The afternoon rain had just stopped, and the air still carried a slight damp, but I felt a strange silence enveloping the space. Under the faint moonlight, I stood in front of the old dam, a place that had been forgotten for years, but had now become the key to ending it all. My hand gripped the cold iron lever tightly, my heart filled with determination. The water behind the dam slowly rose, as if waiting for my command. Each beat in my chest felt like a whisper, a resolve that could not be undone. I had endured countless months, witnessed injustices, schemes, and now, I could not turn back. The illegal houses on my family's land, everything Clara Whitmore had built from lies and abuse of power, would have to pay the price. I pulled the lever. It felt like the world went silent for a moment, as the water began to move, slowly breaking the stillness I had been waiting for all these years. The old dam emitted a soft screech, and then the water, like a wild beast, surged forth. In just seconds, it became a force of nature, sweeping everything away. The illegally constructed homes of the HOA had no time to react. They were swept away, crashing down into the violent water, as if those buildings had never existed. The water carried away not only the homes but also the arrogance and the threats Clara had wielded. The bricks and concrete walls were torn apart, clashing together with a deafening roar. I stood there, showing no sign of joy, merely watching the rushing water as a final verdict. Everything Clara had thought she had controlled for so long was now nothing but rubble. My eyes were fixed on the powerful current, unstoppable and uncontainable. Each drop of water seemed to pour out the frustrations that had built up over so long. I didn't need to do anything more, just stand there and let the water do its work. Clara had brought me to this point, and now I had only one path left to walk. I didn't need to speak anymore, just let the water speak for me. As the water overflowed, sweeping away the houses and returning the land to my family, I felt an unusual sense of relief. My family's land was now reborn, free of illegal structures, free of deceit plot. All that remained was just. There was no way Clara would escape. She could argue, claim it was an accident, but no one could deny the truth. What she had done could not be erased, and now everything had returned to its rightful place. This land would never belong to her, no matter how hard she tried. I turned to look at my house, the place where my family and I had lived for years, where every inch of this land had witnessed countless memories. I looked at Naomi, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes shining with pride. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, then gently stepped outside. I could feel that she saw the change in my eyes, that justice had been served. The water not only swept away the houses, but also carried away the fear and the injustice. I fought not for my own benefit, but for all those who had been oppressed, for those who had lived under Clara's and her henchmen's domination. And as that water swept everything away, I knew that, in the end, people would recognize the truth. I stood there for a moment, looking at the lake, which was slowly calming down, and felt an unprecedented peace. But I knew this wasn't the end. Clara wouldn't give up easily, and I would not stop fighting for what I believed in. But at least, today, I had won. The rushing water flowed, sweeping away everything that Clara and her minions had built on my family's land. I stood firm, unwavering, my hand still gripping the lever, my eyes fixed on the scene in front of me. The anger had passed, and all that remained was the coldness of someone who had waited long enough to see the result of this battle. The illegal homes were gradually erased by the water, turning into rubble, and I felt each layer of burden in my heart being lifted. I didn't need to look back, but when Clara screamed, her voice lost amid the roaring water, "You will regret." Her words felt like a final blow from someone who had run out of strength, from someone who had realized they couldn't change anything anymore. But I felt no fear. Instead, I just looked straight ahead, head, sensing that justice was getting closer. I replied, my voice cold, unwavering, "No, you're the one who should learn to swim." My words were like a conclusion, clearly marking the line between the victor and the defeated. Clara stood there, her face changing color, her eyes flashing with rage she couldn't hide. But in those eyes, there was also a trace of fusion. She knew everything had slipped beyond her control, and now, the water had begun to speak for me. She screamed once more, but I no longer heard anything, because I knew that everything had been decided. In that moment, I realized something important. What I did today wasn't just about reclaiming this land, proving that justice would never bow to absurdity. Clara could try to threaten, but she couldn't do anything when everything had been exposed. When the truth had been set free, she had nothing left to hold on to. The 35 houses she had built, things she believed were built on solid ground, were now swept away without mercy. And I stood there, watching Clara, knowing that she would have nothing left. Failure. Those threats now echoed in the empty space, a disappointment so overwhelming that she could no longer face. I felt the anger inside me dissipate, placed by a strange sense of satisfaction. I didn't need to prove anything more. Everything had been decided. I stood there, watching the water carry everything away, and in my heart, I knew that a new chapter would begin from here. After the waters swept away the 35 houses, the entire neighborhood was submerged in a heavy silence. But the truth could no longer be hidden. The news spread quickly, not just within my community, but beyond the borders of the area. Photos capturing the devastation, the houses swept away, were taken by locals and posted on social media. They became a hot topic, widely discussed by many people. The very next day, major newspapers couldn't ignore this story. 35 HOA houses swept away, a headline that immediately captured the reader's attention. The article delved into the details of the event, interviewing residents, and, of course, it didn't lack strong criticism of Clara and the HOA board. The images of the rubble, the houses now reduced to rubble and waterlogged ground, were accompanied by questions about Clara's responsibility in the illegal construction and the use of my family's land. Outside my office, the phone kept ringing. Calls from friends, neighbors, and even strangers flooded in, offering congratulations, asking about my well-being, and expressing support. But not everyone thought the same way. Some residents still kept silent, avoiding me as though unaware of the situation. Others looked at me with pity, as if they didn't know what to do in this situation. I didn't need their sympathy. I only needed to know that the truth had been revealed. Clara could no longer avoid or argue. She had let her ambition and arrogance lead to this outcome, and now the consequences were rapidly approaching. The residents in the neighborhood began to sigh, a feeling of change taking over the area. Many no longer feared. They spoke to each other, deserved it, brought it upon herself. The so-called community standard Clara had created suddenly seemed delusional, and those who had once feared her now turned their back. The entire neighborhood felt like a village waking up after a long slumber. No one bowed their heads, no one feared anymore, and no one believed that power could buy everything. I didn't pay attention to the gossip. After all, I wasn't living to please everyone. What mattered was that I had done what needed to be done. My land had been returned, justice had been served, and Clara would have to pay for what she had caused. Naomi came to me, her eyes still shining brightly. "Dad, now it's all over, right?" I looked at my daughter, sensing the maturity in her eyes, the strength I had been waiting for. "Yes, Naomi, it's all over," I replied, my voice low. Not because I felt relief, but because I knew that even though the result was clear, life would never be the same again. In the days that followed, the anger and skepticism had not faded. The images of the ruined homes swept away by the flood continued to dominate social media, and Clara was constantly mentioned in people's comments. Some residents started organizing meetings to discuss compensation for the damages, with some even suggesting filing a lawsuit against the HOA for the destruction caused by her. Those who had once stood by Clara now began to realize that her power could no longer conceal the truth, and in the end, they were the ones who would have to face the consequences of her greed. Everything had changed. This neighborhood was no longer a place Clara could control, but a place where voices could no longer remain silent. Those in power would no longer be able to rule through the fear of the people. The ongoing outrage and endless discussions were proof that Clara's power had collapsed. She could no longer control everything, no matter how hard she tried. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Justice having been served, everyone finally realizing that a battle doesn't always require loud victories. Sometimes it only takes the right step, a decisive action. Clara had no idea that, by continuing to use her power to trample others, she had created a hole in the very system she thought was invincible. And now, with the storm having passed, she had nothing left to hold on to. I stood there, looking at the neighborhood, at the roads I had walked countless times, at the places where I had lived and fought. A strange sense of peace enveloped me. Fear was no longer present, and I knew that the dark days were over. The future now belonged to those who dared to stand up, to those who refused to live under the shadow of injustice. Clara Whitmore would never be able to restore what she had lost. As for me, I would continue on my path, continuing to protect what needed to be protected. What I had done today was not just for land or personal gain, but to create a future where everyone could live in fairness and freedom. Change had arrived, and I was the one who brought that change. Since the waters had swept everything away, Clara Whitmore had become a person trapped in a nightmare from which she would never wake up. The homes, the structures she had worked so hard to build, were now nothing but ruin, and that collapse was not just material. It was a fatal blow to the so-called power she had held for so many years. Money, power, and honor that she had desperately clung to were now nothing but smoke, irretrievable. In the days following the dam's opening, Clara did not appear in public. She avoided the media, dodged questions from residents, and only interacted with a few loyal members of the HOA board. What she once used to manipulate others had now become the very tools used to attack her. Each day brought a new article, and each hour someone spoke out against her. She no longer had the means to defend herself, no more powerful cards to play, and everything she had built now lay in ruin. The residents, who had once feared her, now began to hold private meetings, discussing lawsuits, seeking compensation, and even demanding clarification of Clara's abuse of power. Some who had previously applauded Clara now rose to criticize her, calling for justice. Those close to Clara also started to withdraw, no one wanting to be associated with someone who had lost everything. At this point, Clara fully understood that the power she once wielded was nothing more than a lie, and there was no way to salvage it. She, who had once stood at the peak of power, was now empty-handed. Money was gone, power was gone, and honor was gone. The land she had stolen, the houses she thought would enrich her, now became evidence of her greed and deceit. She had nothing left to hold on to, no way to escape truth. The people who had once been under her thumb were no longer afraid, only full of contempt. I stood at a distance, observing Clara from a safe. She was in the living room of the grand mansion, which now held nothing that truly be called hers. Clara's face was pale, her eyes lacking the confidence they once held, only filled with despair and frustration. She stood amidst the wreckage she had caused, unable to escape it. I did not feel regret, not because I lacked sympathy, but because I had faced too many years of injustice to know that sometimes justice only comes after everything has been destroyed. I fought to protect my land, to protect my family, and in this moment, I felt that I had finally reclaimed what was rightfully mine. It wasn't that I wanted to see Clara fail, but rather, she had created her own failure. She had lost everything the moment she engaged in battle with me, not realizing that power cannot last if it is built on lies. In my eyes, she had destroyed herself, and I was merely a witness to the inevitable end. I stood there, watching Clara, without a single word of complaint, without a hint of pity in my gaze. I understood that in life, some people cannot change their fate. Clara Whitmore was one such example. She had gone too far, and now there was no turning back. When everything had collapsed, I did not feel happiness or triumph. I only felt peace, freedom that my family and I had fought to gain. Clara may have lost everything, but I had no regret, because I had done the right thing. The afternoon passed quietly, with a clear sky and delicate clouds drifting by, but I felt a heavy silence within me. I sat by the lake, watching the small waves ripple on the surface of the water, listening to the wind rustle through the branches, like a familiar refrain. Everything around me had changed. Deep inside, I still carried a feeling that wasn't easily forgotten. Reflecting on the hardships, I couldn't help but think of my father. He was the one who always taught me that dignity was the most valuable asset a person could have. "Never bow your head to anyone, Marcus," he once said, his eyes shining with determination. That was advice I had held onto all my life, and now, after everything had passed, I understood it more deeply than ever. The years of facing the injustice and abuse of power from the HOA weren't just a fight to reclaim land. They were a fight to protect the values of myself and my family. My father is no longer here, but his words live on in my mind. I didn't bow my head when Clara and her followers tried to impose their power over me and my family. I never gave in when they tried to twist the truth. And now, with everything laid bare, I felt a great sense of pride for having done the right thing. I sat there, feeling peace, but also the freedom I had fought to reclaim. Naomi sat beside me, her eyes still fixed on the lake. She didn't ask much, but I knew she could feel the changes in the air. I smiled at my daughter, gently resting my hand on her shoulder. "Dad, we won, right?" Naomi asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I looked into her clear eyes, seeing the resilience there. "Yes, Naomi," I replied, my voice lowering. "But justice doesn't come from the heaven. It's not a miracle, but the result of action. It needs a hand on the lever." Naomi remained silent, but I felt the understanding in her gaze. She had seen what I had done, what I had endured, and she understood that sometimes, to achieve justice, we must sacrifice much. Justice is not something we can wait for. It's not something that will come to us if we don't act. Sometimes, to claim what we deserve, we have to take the initiative, face the truth, and accept the consequences. And today, I did just that. The dam I had opened wasn't just an event of material consequence. It was a symbol of reclaiming power, fighting back against those who abused it. The rushing water didn't just wash away Clara and the HOA's houses, but it marked the end of an era of oppression and deceit. Everything they had built through lies was now gone, and what I had fought to protect would never be taken from me again. I looked out at the distant view, where the houses were now just piles of rubble, but I didn't feel regret. What I felt was a sense of satisfaction. Not because I had won, but because I had done what was right. From the beginning, I knew that if I didn't stand up, if I didn't confront those who abused their power, I couldn't live with myself. And I didn't want my daughter to grow up in a world where injustice was tolerated. Justice is not something that just arrived, I repeated, making sure Naomi understood that. It has to be found through action, determination, and courage. No one will give you what's rightfully yours unless you fight for it. Naomi nodded, and I saw a firm belief in her eyes. She knew the road ahead might be full of challenges, but she also understood that she could face any difficulty because she had seen me fight for what was right. We sat there by the lake, in silence, feeling something profound. Life goes on, and no matter how hard Clara or anyone else tries, we cannot erase what has been built on truth and justice. That's the final lesson I wanted Naomi to take away, and it's the lesson I've learned throughout my life. I was no longer afraid, no longer worried about what Clara might do. To protect my family, I did what had to be done, and today, I could proudly say that I stood for the truth. As for Clara, she would never have what she thought she deserved. Now, I only hope Naomi won't face similar challenges, but if it happens, she'll know how to stand strong, just as I did. We will continue to live here, Naomi, I added, my eyes still fixed on the calm lake, because this is our home, and no one has the right to take it away from us. The next day, when everything had started to settle, Naomi and I sat on the porch, quietly gazing at the garden. The scene was the same as any other day, but today, there was a strange shift in the air. I could feel the peace I had longed for, but deep inside, there was another feeling, one I had never had before. It wasn't the joy of victory, but the relief of having done what I needed to do. The homes were swept away, and Clara's exposure marked a significant change, not only for me, for everyone who had ever been oppressed by her. Naomi sat beside me, her eyes shining, yet filled with worry. I understood. She had witnessed so much over the past days, and now, she was seeking reassurance from me. Her small hand gently grasped mine, as if trying to find comfort from her father. In that gaze, I saw trust and empathy. Naomi was no longer the child I had to protect from everything. She had grown in ways I never expected. She looked at me, her eyes filled not only with concern but also with hope. Dad, will everything be okay? Her voice was soft, but I could sense the worry in it. I looked into Naomi's eyes, smiled gently, patted her hand, and said with certainty, "Don't worry, Naomi. Those who abuse their power will eventually be drowned by their own greed." The words I spoke were not just for Naomi, but also for myself. Over the years, I have learned many lessons, from sleepless nights, from the constant struggles, and from the mistakes I couldn't undo. But today, I felt stronger than ever. Clara had chosen the wrong path, and now she had to face the consequence. No one can run from the truth forever. Greed and power had nurtured that greed, and now it was destroying her. Naomi looked at me, as if she could read my thought. She smiled softly and gripped my hand tighter. We sat together in the silence of the afternoon, saying nothing more. A strange sense of peace enveloped me. I knew everything had been settled, not just because we had won, but because I had taught Naomi the greatest lesson. Justice is not something that falls from the sky. It must be sought, and sometimes, it requires unwavering determination to enforce. We sat there for a while, watching the gentle breeze sweep past, carrying golden leaves far away. I felt the calm, not because everything was, but because I had done what was right. And I knew that no matter how hard Clara tried, greed would eventually destroy her, and I would no longer have to fear. My story with Clara Whitmore, from beginning to end, was not just a battle over land ownership or houses. It was a battle over honor, over dignity, and about standing up when trampled upon. I, Marcus Ellington, had to fight not only against an abuser of power, but also against the false power system that Clara and her accomplices had built over the years. From the moment I discovered that my family's land had been stolen, to when all the evidence was exposed, and finally, when the waters washed away everything Clara had built. It wasn't just because I wanted to reclaim my land. It was because I could not let anyone impose their life on mine. I could not let lies and greed continue to destroy what my family and I had built. In the early days, when I discovered my land had been taken, the injustice felt like a deep wound in my heart, but I didn't let it defeat me. On the contrary, it became the motivation to fight. I didn't rush into action. I was patient and prepared carefully. Step by step, I used the available evidence, from ownership certificates to old land map, to expose Clara's deceit. But I didn't stop there. Every word Clara spoke, every time she tried to threaten, only made me more determined. I couldn't back down. I couldn't let silence continue to feed the abuse of power. What Clara failed to realize was that the more she tried to impose her power, the more she tried to control, the more she fell into her own trap. Her threats no longer held any power, because she didn't understand that her greed and self-satisfaction had caused her to lose the support of those around her. The people who had once stood by her, the residents in the community, now began to see the truth. The flood I had set into motion not only swept away her houses but also swept away the domination she had built on fear and deceit. I didn't just win a legal battle, I had returned power to those who were oppressed, to those who had been crushed under Clara's control for so many years. years. The lesson I wanted to convey through this story was not just about protecting property or honor, but about persistence and courage when facing forces greater than yourself. Sometime, in life, we have to face those who abuse power, those who take it upon themselves to control and impose on others. But the important thing is that we should never bow our heads to injustice. We should never let threats or someone's arrogance make us afraid or retreat. My story is proof that, even when you feel alone and surrounded, as long as you remain steadfast and faith in the truth, you will always find your way to victory. Justice is not something that comes to you. It needs to be protected. It needs to be sought. Sometimes, we have to create justice for ourselves. And when you stand firm, when you fight for what is right, those who abuse power will eventually pay the price. Clara lost everything, not because I was stronger, but because she created her own failure. She let greed and arrogance lead to an inevitable end. Clara's failure is also a warning for all of us. No power can last forever if it is built on injustice and lies. In the end, no matter how many schemes or tactics, truth will always prevail. And when the truth speaks, nothing can stop it. I sat by the lake, a place where I had stood many times with my father, feeling a strange peace. Naomi sat beside me, her eyes full of hope, like a child who had witnessed the power of justice and resilience. I knew she would grow up in a world where she wouldn't have to be afraid, where fairness would always have a place. And I also knew I had done the right thing, not just because I had reclaimed my family's land, but because I had taught my daughter a valuable lesson about courage and righteousness. My story is not an end, but a beginning. I didn't just reclaim what was mine, I also fought for the right to live freely for all those who had been oppressed. Clara Whitmore will forever remember that when one person stands up against abuse of power, the whole world will have to listen.